Good afternoon. I'm Nancy McIntyre. I came to Williams in 1970 when the college went co-ed. I was an assistant dean of the college and a member of the admissions committee, and I like to think that I had a small part to play in the favorable transition of this college into a coeducational institution. Many of you have known Dusty since your undergraduate days, and others of us came to know Dusty during his service as a college trustee. I particularly recall Dusty's service as chair of the Williams Bicentennial Commission and then as chair of the Honorary Degrees Committee. After Williams and a PhD in English, Dusty's post-Williams career focused on literary criticism and literary history, particularly relating to the 18th century, and teaching, primarily at NYU, where he was professor of English. Since Dusty and Gail moved full-time to Williamstown, Dusty has added local history to his set of inquiries. Through his involvement with the Williamstown Rural Lands Foundation and the Williamstown Historical Museum, he has written a history of Treadwell Hollow and Flores Glen, a history of Williamstown soldiers and Williams generals in the Civil War. And for the Williamstown Historical Museum, he has curated an exhibition of Williams in the Civil War and another of Big Days in a Small Town with its samples of civic celebrations. When I came to Williams in 1970, I studiously read all of the appropriate public reports, such as those issued by the Committee on Coordinate Education and Related Questions. And of course, I learned much from conversations with some of the principal actors in the decision to go co-ed and that transition. People like Steve Lewis, class of 1960, here someplace, who was one of my closest bosses and mentors. Of course, Jack Sawyer, who was everybody's boss. Later, I met Paul Neely, class of 68, who was one of the several students who did a winter study on other coeducational or coordinate institutions. But I have to admit that my knowledge about change at the college has been profoundly increased by the archival digging done this year by Dusty. Spurred by his interest in the extraordinary number of changes at Williams in a relatively short period of time, that is the 60s, Dusty turned his scholarly eye to one such historical happening, the move to coeducation. Now we can all know Dusty as the college's unofficial archivist, as he tells us of the results of his research into the prehistory of coeducation. Dusty, the stage is yours.
Thank you, Nancy, for that gracious introduction. When he was interviewed many years later, Jack Sawyer said he thought that there were three reasons why the implementation of coeducation at Williams was relatively trouble-free. One was that the fraternities were gone. The second was an exchange program with women's colleges from spring of '69 through the spring of '71 that served as an opportunity to identify and solve problems. And the third was Nancy McIntyre. Coeducation now seems the only natural way to educate college students. It has long seemed so to me. I taught in coeducational institutions for 40 years, and my wife and I sent both a daughter and a son to Williams. But I'm going to take you back more than 50 years to the time when I was an undergraduate at Williams in the early 60s. And co-ed was not just an adjective, it was also a noun, referring to the girls, as we called them, who were imported to Williamstown only on the weekends. The first class of four-year women at Williams graduated 40 years ago, this last week in June 1975. Most discussions of the history of coeducation at Williams begin with the events of 1969, when the first exchange students arrived from Vassar, and when a trustee-faculty committee recommended that the college become fully coeducational starting in September 1971. But coeducation at Williams had what might be called a prehistory. what I did not know when I was a student in the early 60s, and what is still little known today, is that almost from the moment he arrived as president of the college in 1961, Jack Sawyer was thinking about how women might be included at Williams. For years, I've been familiar with a quiet debate about whether Sawyer had some kind of long-term plan for the college when he began his presidency. Some people suggesting that Sawyer, at the outset, mapped out a two-stage plan. First phase, fraternities are gradually eliminated, and then you phase in women. Other commentators, including John Chandler, who served with Sawyer, suggested to me that, and to others, that it didn't feel at the time like there was a long-term plan. It was this debate, was there a plan, wasn't there a plan, when Sawyer arrived, that first got me interested in researching and charting the prehistory of coeducation at Williams. I read widely in the college archives and spoke to as many living witnesses of the events on the Williams campus in the 1960s as I could find, including Chandler, who then served as dean of the faculty, and Steve Lewis, who served as provost. I read minutes of trustee meetings and faculty meetings, the files of several key committees, the papers of two key participants, Jack Sawyer himself and Fred Rudolph. I read the transcript of a 1991 interview with Sawyer in the Williams Oral History Project. And then, to see an important episode in this history from another perspective, I read the papers in the Vassar archives, the papers of the Vassar presidents with whom Sawyer corresponded. And this is basically a report on what I found. Soon after he arrived in July 1961, Sawyer initiated a process, as we all know, that led to transformative changes in the college. When he took office on July 1st, as again, this is well known, he found on his desk a petition from a group of Williams undergraduates urging changes in the fraternity system. Within 3 months, he had appointed the Angevine Committee to advise how best the college might respond. What is not so well remembered is that he also appointed a faculty committee on forward planning to advise him primarily on curricular issues, but also, quote, relationships to other educational institutions nearby and, quote, possible additions to the community that could best serve or enhance our mutual purposes. Sawyer's language in his charge to the Committee on Forward Planning is vague, and we cannot be sure that he was already hinting at the addition of a new college in town. But I have found that in the spring of 1961, even before he took office in July of that year, Sawyer's handwritten notes for the induction speech that he was planning to give the following October include references to enlarging and enriching the community, and even the phrase, another college. And within about a month of that induction speech, Sawyer was in touch with Sarah Blanding, president of Vassar College. I suspect that he contacted her because he had read in the New York Times the previous spring that in a speech to the Vassar Club of New York in March of 1961, she had predicted a dark future for women's colleges and had indicated that Vassar might be looking for cooperation with other colleges. In any case, Sawyer and Blanding met, probably in Poughkeepsie first and then at Mount Hope Farm in Williamstown, where he showed her what might one day be the site of a new women's college. Blanding was interested enough that she pursued the idea with her board chair, and a meeting between the two presidents and a pair of trustees from each college was set up in New York on January 18th, 1962. I was taking exams at the end of the first semester freshman year then. And at the Williams trustee meeting, 2 days later, on January 20th, Sawyer, planting a seed, advised the trustees that the Mount Hope Farm property would probably become available for purchase when the current owner died, and Sawyer suggested the possibility of buying the property to put a coordinate girls' college there. In the next several months, Sawyer pursued this idea with Blanding, sending her on February 28th a white paper laying out the main lines of what he proposed as the joint sponsorship of a new college for women to be located in Williamstown. So Sawyer's first idea about coeducation was apparently not to invite an existing women's college to move to Williamstown and to join with Williams, but to set up a new college. One does wonder why Sawyer might have thought Vassar would be interested in such a project. After reviewing the white paper, the Vassar trustees soon replied that the proposal looked to be rather more advantageous to Williams than to Vassar. And in April of '62, Blanding called Sawyer to tell him that Vassar did not think the idea was going to work. He replied gracefully, expressing hope that she would keep the door open. The archives at Vassar show that Blanding and her advisors continued to think about a possible affiliation with Williams, but they reconceived Sawyer's proposal. A June 2nd, 1962, internal Vassar report weighed the pros and cons, not of a jointly sponsored new women's college in Williamstown, but actually of selling the Poughkeepsie campus and moving Vassar lock, stock, and barrel to Mount Hope. This revised proposal was also shelved. Perhaps, as Sawyer himself said 30 years later, President Blanding, having just decided, apparently, that she would only serve as president of Vassar for 2 more years, in fact, she did retire in the summer of '64, determined to leave the whole matter to her successor. Sawyer didn't give up on Vassar yet, but in the following year, '62-'63, he focused on other possibilities. In September, he sent 2 members of his Committee on Forward Planning to inquire if Skidmore might be interested in moving from Saratoga Springs to Williamstown. He then invited the Skidmore president to lunch in Williamstown in early October, but Skidmore had just made plans to start construction the following spring on a new campus nearby and declined to discuss relocating to Williamstown. Why, one might ask, did Sawyer approach Skidmore next and not another one of the 7 sisters, women's colleges with an academic reputation closer to that of Williams? But it's not difficult to find an answer. Radcliffe and Barnard already had a coordinate relationship with Harvard and Columbia. Bryn Mawr was at that time already arranging for cross-registration at both Swarthmore and Haverford. Smith and Holyoke had a potential natural coordinate partner, Amherst, much closer to home. Wellesley was even further from Williamstown and had several men's colleges in the Boston area from which to choose. And by the fall of '66, Wellesley actually would be engaged in discussion with MIT about cross-registration of students in each other's courses. Sawyer spent much of the fall of that year, fall of '62, working on a major grant application that went to the Ford Foundation in December, focusing on plans for curricular reform. I was able to get a copy of that grant application from Ford. It declares that it was Williams' intention to remain a first-rate 4-year men's residential college. But Sawyer noted that looking ahead, over the next 10 years, the college's further thoughts included the addition to Williamstown of a second collegiate college institution. And he reported to Ford that we have already initiated exploratory discussions about helping a first-class women's college come into being as a coordinate institution to Williams. The following year, '63-'64, Sawyer seems to have realized that curricular reform, which is his primary interest then, might actually be easier to achieve if designed and presented as curricular expansion. Adding courses would require adding more students, probably. He asked the newly appointed provost, Joe Kershaw, to analyze the economic implications of increasing enrollment from 1,200, which it was when I and my classmates were here, to 1,800. What may have been presumably was in the back of Sawyer's mind, is that there were obviously 2 ways to increase enrollment. You can add men or you can add women. While Kershaw was beginning to show that increasing enrollment and holding the faculty level could mean bringing in more tuition revenue without equally adding to cost, Sawyer closed a deal to buy Mount Hope Farm. The purchase of the property did not mean that Sawyer's plans for a coordinate college had already matured. His primary concern over Mount Hope at that time, and the concern of the trustees, was to head off what they thought might be inappropriate development if some other buyer acquired the property. But in Sawyer's mind, as he made clear, the center of that property might be the site of a coordinate college. On October 31st of that year, when he told the faculty about the purchase, he simply said that a central portion of the land would probably be reserved for future educational uses. The faculty then began thinking about educational uses, and soon there were rumors that Mount Hope would be the site of a new coordinate college for girls, or the site of a new graduate program in art history. By January '64, the rumors reached the ears of the editors of the Record, I think one of them might be here, who reported that since it now appeared that a graduate art program would be sited at Mount Hope, campus speculation about coeducational expansion had turned to Denison Park. This was, as most of you know, a residential area at the foot of Spring Street, between the foot of Spring Street and the Knolls, with a small green space in the middle, encircled by several large houses long owned by the college. In any event, Sawyer continued his exploratory conversations with women's colleges. On January 10th, a few days before the campus speculation that was reported in the Record, he met with a representative from the board that governed Pine Manor Junior College in Wellesley, where it shared a campus with Dana Hall, a girls' secondary school. The approach to Pine Manor is puzzling. Sawyer and his advisors had been thinking that it might be possible to start with an existing junior college and build it up into a four-year college. But Pine Manor at that time was a college with a very modest academic reputation. How did Sawyer imagine that a relationship with Pine Manor might strengthen Williams? Well, as it happened, Pine Manor was already planning to move to its own campus in Chestnut Hill, which it later did in 1964, so Sawyer's approach came to nothing there. It was probably also in the spring of '64 that Sawyer approached Elizabeth Hall, the president of the new early college that would open its doors in the fall of '66 as Simon's Rock. The idea for Simon's Rock was to enroll bright high school juniors who were already ready for college and maybe bored of high school, and to provide them with a four-year curriculum. While plans for building a campus near Great Barrington were still at a very early stage, Sawyer asked Mrs. Hall if she might be interested in establishing her institution in Williamstown rather than in Great Barrington. She declined. In the next academic year, '64-65, that would have been my class's senior year, Sawyer continued working on two elements in the coeducation project. First, luring a women's college to Mount Hope, and since that might fail, studying what else might be done with the property. In October, he hosted a meeting at Mount Hope with trustees, senior administrators, alumni, local business leaders to discuss future use concepts and development concepts for Mount Hope. And in November, having learned from the controversy over the publication of the Angevine report, the sudden publication, having learned the importance of keeping his various constituencies well informed as to what he was thinking about, he placed a story in the Williams Alumni Review, again, this is the fall of '64, under the headline, "What uses do you support for Mount Hope?" The story included a trustee guideline, as he put it, that priority should be given to using the core of the property for an allied educational purpose, a school, or a college, or a graduate school. In December of that year, '64, Sawyer and his advisors apparently decided that the time was right to let students know what they were thinking and what they were ruling out. In an interview with the student editors of the Record on December 16th, Sawyer, when asked about plans for coeducation or a coordinate college, said that Williams had no plans for going co-ed or for increasing enrollment. Implying that a coordinate college seemed to make more sense, he added that reducing the number of men would not seem a wise decision. Fred Rudolph, at this time, was clearly a part of Sawyer's inner circle on this matter. And as Sawyer reported to the trustees the following month, he asked Rudolph to study the pros and cons of a new coordinate college and other options, including coeducation. The trustees seemed wary of committing themselves about Mount Hope, and they endorsed an educational institution at Mount Hope as only one of the possibilities that should be considered for developing the property. Rudolph did not submit his study to Sawyer until September of 1965. In it, he carefully weighed the advantages and disadvantages of establishing a new women's college at Mount Hope and of various other options, including a new senior college for women, a transplanted junior college, a new co-ed college, jointly sponsored with Bennington, a new men's college, an expanded Williams College with 600 to 800 more men, or a co-ed Williams with 600 to 800 women. Since he was not asked by Sawyer to make a recommendation about which option seemed best, Rudolph declined to make one. It would appear that Sawyer was still at this stage considering a variety of options and did not want to foreclose any. Meanwhile, he continued to look for a women's college that might be a partner. But there seemed to be very few candidates, and this may have made him again consider institutions that were not at Williams' level. If he saw the matter as Rudolph did, he was perhaps balancing the risk of associating with a lesser college against the financial risk of starting a new coordinate college. During spring vacation of March 1965, he met privately with a representative of Bradford Junior College located in Haverhill, Mass., and then thinking seriously about its future. Actually, it would become a 4-year co-ed college in 1971. According to Sawyer's handwritten notes of that meeting, Bradford was located in a crowded and difficult setting. It had a liberal arts curriculum, and it had a president who was planning to retire soon. This seemed to suggest convergence. Of the junior colleges that Williams might consider, Bradford now seemed to Sawyer, as he said in his notes, to be most likely, if any. 2 days later, he met with his own advisors, including Rudolph, to discuss the various possibilities. And according to his notes of that meeting, Sawyer's, in fact, the group's first choice was moving a 4-year women's college to Williamstown. And the candidates were Wheaton in Norton, Mass., or Wells College in Aurora, New York. Second choice was working with a 2-year college that wanted to become a 4-year college. And Bradford was the best choice there. Third choice was starting from scratch and establishing a new 4-year women's college at Mount Hope. Discussion about what to do with Mount Hope also continued, prompted by Rudolph's study. And at its April '65 meeting, the trustees, when briefed about Rudolph's progress on his at that time incompleted report, suggested that he consider the option of establishing a 2-year senior college for women in Williamstown. The idea apparently was that the brightest female graduates of a good junior college might want 2 more years and would enroll in a senior college at Mount Hope. Thus ended, summer of '65, the first 4 years of Sawyer's presidency. And although he had promoted the project of bringing women to Williamstown, promoted the project with trustees, administrators, and students, and made persistent efforts to attract a women's college to Williamstown, Sawyer was apparently no closer to achieving this goal than when he took office 4 years earlier. But in fact, the groundwork had been laid, and the several constituencies had been informed and had been brought along. Looking back on Sawyer's efforts from 61 to 65, one might well pause to ask why he was initially interested in a coordinate college rather than full coeducation. The reasons are probably several. First, that coeducation would mean a radical transformation of Williams, but adding a coordinate college to the existing institution would mean that the essential core of Williams could continue unchanged. And despite the fact that he brought about bold changes at Williams, Sawyer, as has been noted, was by nature and by principle a cautious, conservative man. Coordinate education was a less radical step than coeducation for a conservative man to take. Second, Sawyer thought that adding a coordinate college would be more acceptable to the college's various constituencies, faculty, students, and especially trustees and alumni, than going co-ed would be. He strongly valued consensus and thought he could build consensus around a coordinate college more easily and more quickly than around coeducation. Third reason, in the early 60s, there were examples of apparently successful coordinate colleges around. Tufts and Jackson, Brown and Pembroke, and many of the single-sex colleges in those early 60s, including Yale, Vassar, Wesleyan, Amherst, and others, were considering establishing a coordinate college. And Hamilton College, in fact, did so. It received a charter to open a new coordinate institution, Kirkland College, in March 65. It was only in the later 1960s that the tide against coordinate colleges turned, and they suddenly came to seem obsolete. Fourth and final reason, adding a coordinate college with its own distinctive curriculum was, Sawyer apparently concluded, the most efficient way to achieve what might have been for him an even more important objective at the time, broadening and modernizing the Williams curriculum. Let me turn now to the second 4 years in his presidency, from 65 to 69. For the next 2 academic years, from fall 65 to spring 67, Sawyer and the trustees focused on what might be done with the Mount Hope property. Early ideas about an art program had fallen off the table. In July 65, Sawyer asked trustee John Lockwood to chair a committee on the future development of Mount Hope. In November, the committee was appointed and an executive secretary hired. Using the property for a new college was on the table, but it was only one of 5 different areas that the committee explored and was not assigned any special priority. Meantime, Sawyer had not abandoned all hopes of co-sponsoring a new women's college with Vassar. In August 65, he wrote to the new Vassar president, Alan Simpson, saying that he was still ready to discuss his 1962 proposal for a jointly sponsored college. And in October 66, when Vassar's Committee on New Dimensions was considering several options for Vassar, but before it began serious discussions about coeducation with Yale, that many of you know about, Sawyer invited Simpson to Williamstown and showed him 3 possible sites for a women's college. One was Mount Hope, a second was Denison Park, 40 acres, and the third was the Cluett Estate on Gale Road with 170 acres. It's characteristic of Sawyer that he continued to pursue Vassar and also that he tried to keep open several different options. He was apparently beginning to think that an in-town location might be a better site for a women's college than Mount Hope Farm. And from August to December of 66, the college, which already owned several parcels in Denison Park, was quietly buying up property in the neighborhood. The Mount Hope Committee continued to meet for the next year and a half, but it quickly realized that using the big house, Elm Tree House, would require considerable investment. A lot of basic maintenance had been deferred, and the pipes bringing water to the house from Wabeeka Springs were leaky. If there were to be a college at Mount Hope, and if students might take some courses there and some courses at Williams, then hundreds of students would need to drive or be driven back and forth to town along a narrow, twisting Green River Road. By late spring '67, the Mount Hope Committee's work was suspended. But the idea of a coordinate college was still very much alive, discussed at both trustee and faculty meetings. And in April '67, a new committee was established, again chaired by trustee John Lockwood, this was a committee on coordinate education and related questions. The very name suggests that the committee was to look into the idea of a coordinate college, but was not to be limited to that form. Like the Angevine Committee, this was a joint trustee-faculty committee with Fred Rudolph as the vice chair and Steve Lewis as executive secretary, along with several senior faculty and administrators and a pair of junior faculty. It was this new committee which would, 2 years later, recommend that the college become coeducational. But that was not what the committee was thinking when it began its work. Indeed, when Sawyer wrote again to President Simpson of Vassar in mid-May of '67, reporting on the appointment of this new Lockwood Committee, he obliquely suggested that Vassar might want to do something similar. There is, he said, much to be said for old liberal arts colleges creating new entities. Sawyer was probably still thinking an arrangement for joint sponsorship of a new college might work out. But Simpson responded 2 weeks later to say that by this point, Vassar was thinking about establishing its own coordinate college, or maybe even going co-ed. 2 days later, Sawyer wrote again to Simpson. 2 days after he wrote to Simpson, there appeared in the record here, under the headline, "College Moves to Coordinate Education," an article reporting that faculty, alumni, administration, and townspeople were almost without exception in favor of introducing women to the Williams setting. Interestingly, the reporter went on, the most adamant opposition came from students, who apparently worried that the presence of women would distract them, or would maybe make them shave in the morning, or would bring radical changes to the all-male bastion they were comfortable with. Sawyer himself was reported in this article to say that a coordinate girls' school might enlarge and enrich the college. Those verbs are striking. They're the same ones that appear in those handwritten notes he drafted 6 years earlier when he was preparing his induction speech, enlarging and enriching the community. The committee, Lockwood Committee, proceeded slowly, gathering information about coordinate education as it was being practiced on other campuses. During the '67-68 academic year, it began to focus on 3 possibilities. 1, a coordinate college in Williamstown. 2, an exchange program with both men's and women's colleges. And 3, some kind of shared facility in New York or Washington where students from Williams and other isolated liberal arts colleges might spend part of the school year, overcoming isolation and drawing on the riches of an urban environment. Meanwhile, Steve Lewis, through his training as an economist, was modeling the effect of increasing enrollment by adding 600 women or 600 men to the college. And in his capacity as executive secretary of the Committee on Coordinate Education, he was visiting coordinate colleges. In March '68, he reported back to the committee his conclusion that at the classroom level, there wasn't much difference between coordinate education and coeducation, from the point of view of the students and the faculty. In the same month, Fred Rudolph reported to the faculty that the Lockwood Committee was focusing on a proposal for a separate coordinate college. And in the March 13th faculty meeting, there ensued a period of very active discussion. Dean Ben Laborie, whom many of us remember, he was the dean when we were students, evoking the language of the Board versus Brown of Education Supreme Court decision of a few years earlier, questioned whether a separate coordinate college would be inherently unequal. But at the end of that academic year, 67-8, the Lockwood Committee was still focusing on a coordinate college. In June, the committee discussed another interim report drafted by the committee chair, and in August published it in the Alumni Review, reaffirming that the committee was continuing to review the idea of a new coordinate college, an exchange program, and a shared urban facility. While some on the campus were beginning to lean in the direction of coeducation, the Lockwood Committee was not yet officially ready. Academic year 68-9 was to bring the issue to a head and a decision. In early September, Sawyer and his dean of faculty met with their opposite numbers from Vassar to discuss a Williams-Vassar exchange program, which was going to start just 4 months later. Amazing how they could put together an exchange program in less than a semester. In October of 68, Sawyer and the president of Smith convened a meeting of 10 New England liberal arts colleges to discuss a much broader 10-college exchange program that might begin in September 70, nearly 2 years later. By establishing exchanges with women's colleges, Sawyer was in effect setting up a test of one of the Lockwood Committee's ideas. At the time, some people thought that an exchange program was actually a means of deferring coeducation, perhaps indefinitely. In retrospect, others, including Sawyer himself, have argued that it turned out to be a means of preparing the way for a coordinate college in Williamstown or for full coeducation. Other groups on campus were equally active. Students formed a student committee on coordinate education and set up a schedule of visits to other campuses. A faculty subcommittee, chaired by Don Gifford of the English department, studied what changes to the curriculum might be needed if women students were to take Williams courses. There was much discussion within the subcommittee and elsewhere about what kinds of courses female students would want to take. Most quaintly assumed at the time that women would prefer music and arts and foreign languages and would not want to study hard sciences, economics. 45 years later, we can see that these assumptions were completely wrong. But there was already a growing consensus among the faculty that coeducation was the right choice. The beginning of 1969 brought some convergence, though none as yet explicit endorsement of coeducation. In early January, the Gifford Subcommittee recommended to the Faculty Curriculum Committee that when Williams began teaching women, it should have a single faculty and a single curriculum, no separation. The full faculty, responding to an invitation from Steve Lewis, voted to endorse the Curriculum Committee's recommendation to, quote, undertake the education of significant numbers of women. This recommendation did not yet specify coeducation, leaving it to the Lockwood Committee to decide, based on further study, what form, coeducation or coordinate education, it ought to take. The Williams faculty, which apparently trusted Sawyer to do the right thing in the right way, declined here to get out ahead of the trustees. A record story in early '69 reported that now 81% of the students who responded to the poll were in favor of including women either in a coordinate college or by having Williams go co-ed. Sawyer and his senior staff worked quietly and patiently in these months to move the trustees along. Sawyer was in regular touch with Lockwood, reporting in one letter to him about the faculty vote and arguing that this move toward the inclusion of women was no mere academic fashion, but a durable trend with solid educational merits. And in another letter, that the committee's report should not be regarded merely as a trial balloon, but should present the committee's decided views on the matter, adding that it was very important to build a growing consensus. Again, that word consensus, important to Sawyer. The provost reported to the Lockwood Committee in January that because female students would, as it was thought, probably choose under-enrolled courses in art, music, and languages, adding women would allow the college to bring in additional revenue without lowering the quality of undergraduate education or affecting the faculty-student ratio. At their meeting at the end of January, the trustees approved a resolution declaring that they responded favorably to the reports of the Lockwood Committee, to the vote of the faculty and the student studies, and that they were now inviting specific recommendations about what to do from the Lockwood Committee by the June trustee meeting. Nothing yet in writing to indicate that the college was ready to commit to coeducation, but according to one insider's report, the trend of trustee sentiment was pretty clear when one powerful and conservative trustee who had resisted coeducation observed at the January meeting that coeducation does seem like the right thing to do. The decisive move to coeducation came at the next trustee meeting at the end of April 1969. In retrospect, we can see that this was simply the last and final step in Sawyer's patient and shrewd campaign to bring people along. But for some on the ground at the time, this move was not inevitable. And the month of April '69 began very inauspiciously. On April 5th, a group of black students took over Hopkins Hall as part of their campaign to press for the college administration for a Black Studies program. Steve Lewis, sidetracked from his work with the Lockwood Committee, was designated as Sawyer's point man and was involved in his intense discussions with the students until they agreed to evacuate the building 3 days later. Amazing how all the things that were going on at the same time in those years in the 60s. Lockwood himself, the committee chair, was engaged in completing his report to be presented to the trustee meeting. And on April 10th, a couple of weeks before the meeting, he wrote to a Vassar vice president that he himself wasn't actually not yet ready to reach final conclusion. He wanted, he said, to defer any final decision for a year, pending an assessment of the student exchange program. If it worked, okay. If it didn't work, maybe not. He was not yet sure if the exchange would turn out to be merely a temporary stopgap or even a, quote, substitute for ever admitting women full-time. Something happened to change his mind between April 10th and the trustee meetings that began on April 24th. One thing that happened, the Student Committee on Coordinate Education, having renamed itself the Student Committee on Coeducation, issued a final report on April 23rd, forcefully recommending coeducation rather than a coordinate college. Its report was unanimously endorsed by the college council and presented the next day to the Lockwood Committee. Second thing that happened, John Chandler, then the president of Hamilton College and just elected a Williams trustee, spoke confidentially to the Lockwood Committee, reporting that relationships between Hamilton and its coordinate partner, Kirkland, were not without problems. Coordinate education was an expensive proposition since it involved a lot of duplication. You got 2 registrars, 2 deans of students, and 2 everything. It was also the case that close and constant coordination between the staffs and faculties of each of the 2 institutions ate up a lot of meeting time. Lockwood committee members were sobered by this report. The report was apparently not news to Sawyer, who had already had several confidential conversations with Chandler about coordinate education as practiced at Hamilton Kirkland. By April, Sawyer had pretty clearly made up his mind, probably in part because of what Chandler told him, that coeducation was more workable, even if only because it was less expensive than coordinate education, and because he could see where the consensus was building. It was probably he who suggested to Lockwood that he might want to have Chandler meet with the committee. Although the committee did not leave complete minutes of its deliberations, it seems clear from the flow of correspondence that its members were also cumulatively influenced by the events of the previous 9 months, particularly an endorsement by Princeton of coeducation in a famous report now famous, in September 1968, and Yale's decision in November 68 to go co-ed as early as the next year. When the trustees at both Trinity and Colgate voted in January 69 for coeducation, it started to look like a national trend, or at least a New England trend. If Williams did not go co-ed, wouldn't this mean that all the best female applicants would be scooped up by its rivals? And there were those reassuring internal reports from Kershaw and Sawyer and Lewis. Coeducation would be economically manageable and would in fact be less expensive than setting up a new coordinate college. Taken together, these were apparently enough reasons to convince the holdouts, including Lockwood, that coeducation was the preferred option. When the full Board of Trustees met on April 25th, it received a report from the Lockwood Committee recommending, first, that the college continue the exchange program, this now with 12 colleges, and second, that the college, quote, enrolls significant numbers of women students as regular members by 1971. The key decision had been made. Although some members of the Lockwood Committee had apparently been warming to the idea of coeducation for many months, it was not until late April that the entire committee was ready to decide and to go on record. On May 27th, 1969, Steve Lewis asked the faculty to endorse the Lockwood report, which it promptly did 2 days later, by voice vote without dissent. And on June 7th, the Board of Trustees formally accepted the recommendation of the Lockwood Committee, endorsing the recommendation to admit women beginning in September 71, still 27 months hence. What does this review of the prehistory of coeducation at Williams say about the style of Jack Sawyer's presidential leadership? I think it confirms the judgment that Sawyer was, at the same time, a cautious conservative, concerned to preserve the best of a fine old college, and a far-seeing visionary, anticipating where the college might be 10 or 15 years hence, and what could practically be done to help the college, as he said shortly before he took office, realize its potential. As a pragmatist, he looked for opportunities. He considered several different problems: the limitations of an isolated single-sex college, a narrow curriculum, the adverse consequences of keeping enrollment at 1,200, and he looked at several different solutions at the same time: changing the residential system, increasing enrollment, bringing in women, coordinate college, coeducation. All of these things were considered at the same time. He was very concerned, especially after June of 1962 and the controversy over the Angevine report, to build consensus among the several constituencies he reported to about the rightness of the major changes on which the college planned to embark. He was also strategic about shaping those constituencies, choosing trustees, and they were chosen with major input from him, choosing trustees who could help advance his agenda, and appointing the right trustees and faculty to key committees. He was very concerned about process, working through trustee and faculty committees, but he was also ready to work privately, on his own, or with a couple of trusted faculty or trustees to explore an idea before it was ready to be presented to a larger group. He was persistent, even dogged, in pursuing an idea that he thought had merit. He just wouldn't take no for an answer from Vassar for more than 3 years. But he was gracious about it and took pains to maintain good relations with anybody who might be in a position to help the college. And finally, he might have been the first Williams president to understand the importance of print media in advancing his agenda. Via articles carefully placed in the Record or the Williams Alumni Review, copies of newspaper clippings from the Times that he forwarded to his presidential peers at other colleges, or even suggestions for stories that he passed on to a New York Times education reporter. It's not surprising that in 1963, he put the president of Time, Inc. on the Williams board, and that in 1968 he added the executive vice president of the New York Times. How do I then answer the question which prompted my research? Did Sawyer enter office in 1961 with a grand two-stage plan? If he did, and I find no real evidence of it, he certainly kept it to himself. I've come to the conclusion that he had too much good sense and political wisdom to draw up a blueprint in advance, that he began his presidency with some basic ideas, realizing the full potential of a liberal arts college, developing an enlarged and enriched community, and that his genius was in figuring out as he went along how and in what forms those ideas might be harmoniously and productively implemented. Thank you.